On New Year's Eve 2025, I had an MRI. On January 2, I found out I had a tumor in my spine. That tumor was up here at T3, which is right between your shoulder blades. This surgery comes with all kinds of complications, like becoming paralyzed. And yet 4 months later, I stood on top of a 6,000 meter mountain in Nepal. A year ago, we had been in Nepal and I got really sick. So sick my eyebrows fell out. Now I had thought at the time that that was just a result of how sick I had been because I came home and I got given a big bunch of antibiotics to deal with the infection that I caught. But it turns out that your hair falling out is a sign of systemic stress. And this had been going on for quite some time at that point, like about 2 years. Looking back, there were signs on that trip that my body was really struggling. For instance, I don't normally get cold feet at night when we're asleep, regardless of the altitude, but that trip I had cold feet as low as 3,000 meters. And I had thought this was just a combination of old age and altitude, meaning I needed to make some adjustments to what I was wearing so I could be comfortable with the temperature. It turns out they weren't cold, they were numb, because the message that travels down your spine through your spinal cord was being impacted by this tumor inside my spine. By November, it was starting to get really obvious that there was something very wrong with me. I could be going for a walk and my legs would give way. I would suddenly veer left and take 3 or 4 steps to catch my balance. I could barely walk up and down a set of stairs. I lose my breath so quickly at the moment. And if I did a squat or a lunge, I had very little chance of getting back up under my own power without using my hands to grab onto something. Going to the doctor, we started running a bunch of tests and we started eliminating things one by one. And to be honest, by the time we found out it was a tumor, it wasn't really much of a surprise. Because of where the tumor was located, remember, right up high in my spinal cord, it means it was touching on all the nerves for everything below my shoulder blades. That meant things like core control, even going to the toilet, walking, squatting, anything from about the ribs down was problematic for me. And when I first saw the MRI, because I'm not a doctor, I totally misread it and misunderstood what the problem was. I thought the tumor was on my spine and all they'd need to do is kind of just scratch it off from the surface of my spine. But it turns out the tumor was inside my spine, which is why it was such a complicated surgery. And that meant that to get to the tumor, they had to cut all the muscles in my back, move them out of the way, drill a hole into my spine, carefully move the spinal cord out of the way so they didn't damage it, and then scrape the tumor away from inside my spine, trying not to damage any nerves along the way. So typical luck of mine, I had the most difficult kind of tumor you can get. And the surgery, despite the skill of my surgeon, does come with a lot of risks. It's got about an 18% chance of some kind of negative consequence happening. And if you think about it, that's like a 1 in 6 chance. That's like playing Russian roulette just to go and have surgery. The doctor was very clear about how serious the surgery would be, how long it would be, and how long the recovery would take, and how limited I would be during that recovery period. And that gets me to tip number 1 about how to cope with problems in your life. You see, there's a really big difference between seeing something as a challenge or as a threat. 2 people can see the same incident in very different ways. You and I could go bungee jumping and I could be terrified and you could see it as a thrilling adventure. It's the exact same experience for us, but the way we view it changes the way our body reacts to it. And when you start to see things as a stress or a threat, you start to see everything as a threat. So imagine you're walking through the jungle and you see a snake. Now you're on high alert for snakes. Everything looks like a snake. A tree branch looks like a snake, a root on the ground looks like a snake looks like a snake, but all of a sudden you're seeing snakes everywhere. Once you start to see a threat, you start to perceive everything as threats. Or you can see it as a challenge and suddenly it just becomes a problem you need to solve. For me, this was a tremendous opportunity to test my programming skills and see how I could go from flat on my back post-surgery to standing on top of a mountain in Nepal only a few months later. One of the things that really worked in my favor was that the lead into surgery was very short. I found out I had a tumor on January 2, and on January 11 I was in hospital getting ready to have surgery. There wasn't much time to panic in that short period of time. I had to make sure work was up to date, that my clients were going to be looked after for the few days that I would be knocked out, and that everything at home was going to run as smoothly as possible while I wasn't going to be there. My first night in hospital, stress-free. I had a nice meal, I had an MRI, and I went to bed. I had been told that the next day I would be having surgery after lunch. That all changed at about 6 a.m. in the morning when a nurse rushed into my room, threw a surgical gown at me and said, "They're coming to pick you up in a few minutes." And straight away, massive adrenaline dump, my whole body started shaking, and it was such an unpleasant experience that I decided I didn't want to spend another minute in that state if I didn't have to. I grabbed my phone, I turned on a meditation timer, and I started meditating. And I was still meditating 5 hours later when they finally did come to get me for my normally scheduled surgery. Now, I've never had any success with meditation in the past, and yet this one time where I really needed to calm down, my brain automatically went there and allowed me to focus on calming myself down. And that's tip number 2 for dealing with stress or threat. You can instantly change the way you feel about something simply by allowing yourself to focus on your breathing. There are multiple studies to show how useful this is. Special forces use it. I focus on a simple 4 in, hold for 4, exhale for 4, and 4 out cycle. That allows me to stay nice and calm, nice and relaxed, and I was able to do this for 5 hours and allow myself to be stress-free up until the time they really did take me for surgery, at which point they pulled me away from my phone and my meditation app and my body started shaking violently again. But I only had to spend a few minutes there versus 5 hours, which is what I would have done in the first place. As a sign of how good my mindset was, the first thing I said post-surgery was, "I'm tougher than Wolverine." Now, that was in reference to the fact that I've now got a piece of titanium in my spine, so like Wolverine, my spine is made of metal. But then I went on a big rant about the amount of dishonesty and lying involved in Hollywood with all these actors playing superheroes and the sheer amount of drugs they take. Luckily for me, there was no one else in the ward with me. The morning after surgery, I made my second misunderstanding of this entire procedure, and that was that the physio came along to see me and told me that to get out of ICU and just into a regular ward, I had to be able to walk around the ward and show some kind of independence. So I said, all right, let's do that. And I got up and I went for a walk around the ward with a person either side of me to make sure I wasn't going to fall over and hurt myself. As it turns out, they weren't expecting me to go for a walk for another 2 days, but positive mindset and me just believing that this was something I had to accomplish to get back to a regular ward and then get home as fast as possible, I just went and did this thing without any negative stories in the way in the meantime. Prior to surgery, before finding out that my legs were giving way, we had actually booked this trip to Nepal. Now, I knew within a couple of days of surgery that I would be okay to go on this trip for a couple of reasons. And this is where tip number 3 comes in. Tip number 3 is about taking a good, realistic, honest view of where you are right now and where you'd like to get to. It's like a GPS. You see, a GPS works great, provided you know the exact starting location and the exact ending location. Now, I watch a lot of people set goals and they're really good about setting a finishing location, but they're very dishonest with themselves about what the starting location really is. I had to be honest with myself. I was a 53-year-old guy who'd just had major surgery, had all the muscles in his upper back cut out of the way, which prevented me from doing any upper body strength training for months leading up to our trip. I had balance problems, I'd lost 50% of my lower body strength, and there was no way I could even count myself as fit at this point. And I was allowed to do 2 things post-surgery. I was allowed to ride a bike, and I could walk with a 10-kilo pack on for a limited period of time. And so that's what I did. I did those 2 things, but I set about creating a plan that allowed me to use those 2 things to be successful to summit these mountains. Because the truth of our trip was that while it was a 3-week trip and we were going to climb 2 mountains, there was only 1 day on this trip where the upper body stuff was going to come into play. The entire rest of the trip relied on aerobic fitness and being able to walk with a moderately heavy pack on for an extended period of time, which were both things that I could do. So I knew I could get myself fit enough to do this, except for this 1 day that would be a question mark right at the end of the trip. Now, our goals initially were to climb a thing called Mera Peak. Mera Peak is nearly 6,500 meters high. It's the highest trekking peak in Nepal, but it's just a walk up. At 6,500 meters, you have about half the amount of oxygen that you do at sea level. At sea level, there's about 21% oxygen in the air. At 6,500 meters, it's about 9%. So everything takes twice as long and it's twice as hard. Our plan was that after summiting Mera Peak, We would then go and try to summit Island Peak, which while a bit shorter, is a much harder climb. And as opposed to Mera Peak, which was a trekking peak, Island Peak you have to climb. Normally, Island Peak has a section that takes about an hour. That's about 100 to 120 vertical meters of working on a fixed line to go up this snowy headwall. This year, thanks to low snowfall, it was a fairly rocky technical section to climb that instead of taking an hour, took us about 2 hours. Getting ready for this trip, I have to say there was not one single day where I felt training was easy. I don't recall feeling fit or strong at any point leading up to going away on this trip. Just the exact opposite to how you want to feel when you're going away to do one of the hardest things you've ever done in your life. I can recall muscle soreness simply from going out and hiking with a moderately heavy pack on. I can recall finishing those hikes and coming home and falling asleep for 2 hours because I was so exhausted from what should have just been a literal walk in the park for me. Every single day was hard, but by keeping, again, that honest appraisal and then allowing myself to see things as a challenge versus a threat, I never felt overwhelmed by what was coming up. We left home on May 12, arrived in Nepal on May 13, and the next day we headed into the Makalu region, which is where Mera Peak is, starting at 2,300 meters, which is already as high as the highest thing in Australia. And then we started going up from there. We spent multiple days around the 3,000 meter mark before finally getting to about 4,500 meters, which is where problems always seem to start. For me, up to about 4,000 meters, sleep is fine, energy levels are fine, appetite is fine, but once we crack that 4,500 meter mark, the wheels start to fall off slowly, slowly, slowly. Appetite goes, energy levels go down, you don't sleep as well, everything becomes much, much harder and much, much slower. Physically, I was at my limit pretty much every day, right from day one. I got to watch my wife waltz along down these trails while I was really struggling to keep up. In particular, anytime we went downhill, my balance still isn't so great post-surgery. I still can't feel my left foot properly, so every time I put my left foot on the ground, I'm not exactly sure whether it's stable or not. I'm quite slow going downhill compared to, I would just say, everybody else. Very hard effort for me. I would fall asleep by 7 o'clock every night and sleep all the way through till about 5 o'clock the next morning when the sun would come up. Probably the hardest thing to do on this trip was admit to myself exactly how weak I really was at this point. I bet there's very few guys watching this who would put their hand up and happily admit that their wife was stronger and fitter than them, and yet that's the situation I found myself in every single day. My wife is stronger than me, she's faster than me, she's fitter than me. I am the weaker one in this relationship right now. But this honesty with myself was essential because I had to ask her if she could slow down a bit so I didn't risk hurting myself or overexerting myself trying to keep up and risk making the second part of the trip with the actual climbing in it too hard for myself because I'd end up at the foot of a mountain already so fatigued I'd have no energy to climb. It meant I had to be honest with the guides, and I remember sitting down with them and showing them photos of the surgery and the scars and how difficult walking was afterwards and explaining to them about my balance problems and about why I might be struggling with some things. And that's also not a natural thing for a lot of guys to do. Many guys think they shouldn't be asking for help, that they should be able to tough things out. But if you try to tough things out, you'll find you get to a point where you can tough it out and you can tough it out and you can tough it out. But now the problem is so big and so overwhelming, you're probably going to get crushed by it. It's much better to be honest at the start and manage it properly while it's a lot smaller and easier to deal with than wait until you get crushed by it later on. Leaving Mera Peak High Camp at 5,800 meters just after midnight, there was never a doubt for me. Every single step of that walk, I knew I was going to make it. There were multiple times while walking up where I even caught myself smiling to myself about how easy I was finding it and how much fun I was having. I wasn't fast, I was taking 2 breaths per every step that I took, but I was steady. In the end, we took about 5 hours to summit. The average is 4 to 6 hours, so that's right in the middle, and that's pretty good for 53 years old and only 4 months post-major surgery. Now, Island Peak was very different. We started Island Peak at about midnight, and even just to get to Crampon Point was about 5 hours of scrambling up some rock to get to the start point of climbing the mountain. And I struggled right from the first step on that night. From Crampon Point, There's actually a little bit of fixed rope work needed to even get to the point where the genuine climbing starts. For me, that was so difficult given how limited I was allowed to be with strength training prior, that after I got through that section, my right arm was so tired I wasn't even sure I was going to be able to start the actual climbing part after having been exhausted just from the start. The final head wall normally takes about an hour to climb. It took us about 2 hours because of the technical nature of it this time, but that also brought some benefits with it. And that leads me to tip number 4. The benefit is that sections of rope are usually only about 20 to 30 meters at a time, and we had to climb something like 100 to 120 meters vertically. That meant that I could break the challenge down into individual sections of rope of only 20 or 30 meters of work. And I would break each of those down into a simple step, slide my ascender up, take 2 breaths and go again process. And I just kept repeating this until I got through one section of rope, and then the next section of rope, and the next one, and the next one, literally breaking the journey down into 2 steps and 2 breaths at a time. Finally, we got to the top. Now I have to say, climbing Island Peak was the hardest single day thing I've ever done, and I've done some dumb shit in my life. I remember getting to the top and my wife was filming and she wanted to hug me, and I lasted about 5 seconds and I had to beg her to let me go because I needed to sit down, I was so tired. Even my own father said to me when he saw the summit photos how tired I looked from that, and I had to admit to him exactly how hard I'd found the Island Peak climb. And that leads me to tip number 5. Tip number 5 is to remove yourself from the problem. You see, if you allow yourself to talk about I, me, you are not distanced from the problem at all, and you're able to make irrational, emotional, spontaneous decisions. If you can distance yourself from this decision, even just a little bit, by separating yourself from being involved in the problem, by saying something like, is Andrew struggling? Why is Andrew struggling? What can Andrew do to make this problem better for himself? How can Andrew improve his day right now? You see, all you're doing is having a conversation with a friend and offering them logical advice. There's no emotion involved here at all, because how easy is it to give advice to someone else? And by making that distance between the impulse and the decision, you allow yourself time to make good decisions. Now drop a comment below if you've ever faced your own mountain, because that's what peak performance is really about. It's not about literal mountains. It's about achieving our best every single day for the rest of our lives.